Hi, and welcome to the first of our short lectures from chapter 11 in your textbook. So, this morning I want to talk to you a little bit about communication climates, and specifically today we'll talk about disconfirming and disagreeing messages. When we talk about communication climate, what we're talking about is the emotional tone or the feeling of a relationship. So it's not so much about the activities that you engage in together or even the actual content of your communication as it is the way that you feel about the person you're communicating with and the way that you treat them. So we know that communication climates are important to relationships. So couples who create and maintain emotionally healthy, positive climates generally have enduring and happy relationships. We also know that children who feel confirmed, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second, have more open communication with their parents, that they feel better about themselves, they have higher self-esteem, and they experience less stress. We also know in the workplace that positive communication climates lead to increased job satisfaction, you're happier with your job, and it also helps to facilitate things like praise and open communication. So, when it comes to confirming messages, right, we find that the climate of the relationship is based on the degree to which the people believe themselves to be valued by another person, right? So the communication climate is based on how much the communicators value one another. Now, confirming communication are messages that convey valuing. So if you're sending confirming messages, that means you are indicating that you value the other person, that they mean something to you, right? That you care about them. A disconfirming message is one that shows lack of regard or just the fact maybe that you don't value that person. Now, one of the problems, of course, with these kinds of evaluations is that they're subjective. So a confirming or disconfirming message is kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? You might say something that you think is confirming, but the other person might not view it that way. So it's important to recognize, again, that these are subjective and that they can vary, and that it's ultimately up to the person who's receiving the message to decide whether or not it's confirming or disconfirming. So some kinds of disconfirming messages. We'll start with the bad ones, right? Your book lists 7 types. So there is, for example, the impervious response. And with the impervious response, it's pretty simple. You just ignore the other person's message. So someone's sitting, your wife or your husband sitting there and says, it really upsets me when you do X, Y, and Z, and you just don't say anything. That's the impervious response. Then there's interrupting. So we know that when we interrupt people a lot, it has a disconfirming effect. It makes them feel as if they aren't valued because you're not listening to what they're saying. Then there's the relevant response, where you respond with something completely unrelated to what the other person has just said. The tangential response, where you use the other person's message as a starting point to talk about something else. The impersonal response, so that's the response that's just loaded with cliches and never is a real, true kind of response, right? So, for example, you might go to your parents and say, "I just broke up with my girlfriend, and I'm really upset," and they say something to you like, "Oh, there's plenty of fish in the sea," or "Time heals all wounds." Those are examples of impersonal responses. There are ambiguous responses. These are responses that contain more than one meaning, right? You can interpret them in different ways. And then finally, the incongruous response, which contains 2 messages that seem to contradict each other. So again, these are all forms of disconfirming communication. So these kinds of messages suggest to the person who receives them that we don't value them. Now, there are also kinds of disconfirming messages that we categorize as disagreeing messages. So with disagreeing messages, you're pretty much just saying, hey, you're wrong. Now, the most destructive way to disagree with another person is through aggressiveness. So if we're getting aggressive verbally and certainly physically, this is not helpful to maintaining a healthy or positive relationship. Now, when we get aggressive, we have a tendency to go after the self-concept of other people in order to hurt them psychologically, right? It's an intentional attempt to make people feel bad about themselves. And we can do that in a lot of ways. Name calling, putting people down, being sarcastic with people, taunting them, bullying them. These are all examples of disagreeing messages, and obviously these are disconfirming as well. If you're calling somebody an idiot or something of the sort, then clearly it indicates that you don't really value them. Now, recently, bullying has really come to the fore as a major topic in education, particularly elementary education and middle school. And it has in part because of focus on a lot of the school shootings and things that have occurred in the past 2 decades, and people are becoming worried about it, right? Because we know as we do more and more studying bullying, right, as we do more academic studies and scientific studies, that it has significant effects on people, right? And this is particularly true if it's happening at the level of family, right? If your brother or sister are bullying you, the effects are even more long-lasting than if you go to school and somebody picks on you. So we're finding more and more evidence that bullying really is a very negative form of communication, and one that has long-lasting effects, right? So I remember when I was a kid and people would get bullied, the teachers would say, "Oh, just tell me, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me," right? And the whole idea was that as long as they're just calling you names, it's not supposed to really impact you, right? Not in the same way as, for example, getting physically bullied, right? And the problem with that is it's just not true, right? We're finding again more and more now that name calling and psychological bullying is perhaps even more pernicious than physical bullying. And of course now, since I've grown up, we now have a whole new form of bullying, which is online bullying, right? And this is something that perhaps you're familiar with, because we know that at least 15% of students report that they've experienced online bullying. And frankly, I think this is a low number. I've read accounts that put it up higher, closer to 50%. So, some other forms of disagreeing messages. One way that we disagree is through complaining. And complaining, at least from a communication perspective, is when you're not really prepared to argue, you don't really want to fight, but you still want to let somebody know that you don't agree. You're registering dissatisfaction. Now, satisfied couples, people who are happy with one another, tend to offer behavioral complaints, right? So they'll criticize someone else's behavior instead of attacking them personally. So an example would be, "Oh man, you never make the bed," right? Whereas people that are unsatisfied with each other tend to make complaints that are personal, what we call in rhetoric ad hominem attacks, or attacking the person instead of the problem, right? So, "Oh, you're such a slob," right? I mean, so when you say you're a slob, you're attacking the person instead of the behavior. Now, it's important to understand complaining in a relationship isn't necessarily a bad sign. It's something that people do. It's common in relationships. So just because you're complaining doesn't mean your relationship is headed the wrong way. However, the kind of complaining you do, again, behavioral complaints, are much healthier than personal complaints. Now, the other thing we need to talk about here is argumentativeness. This is presenting and defending positions on issues while attacking the positions taken by others. So this is arguing, right? Now, a lot of people assume that arguing in a relationship is automatically bad, and it's not. Indeed, we know that argumentativeness is associated with a number of positive traits. People who argue usually have an enhanced self-concept, so they're confident in who they are. Oftentimes they demonstrate competence in communicating, so they're effective communicators. And it can also help lead to positive workplace environments. So if you're in an environment where you can argue, that means that you're free to voice your opinion, right? That people give you that avenue of expression. And that's much better than being in a workplace environment where people are discouraged from speaking their minds. Again, though, the way that we keep argumentativeness positive is by attacking issues instead of people. So just the same way in a close interpersonal relationship, you would attack the person's behavior instead of them personally. In the workplace or even in sort of broader social environments, you want to attack issues when you're talking about them with people and not the people themselves. You want to avoid that ad hominem personal attack. All right, that's it for this short lecture. Next time we'll talk about confirming messages. Thanks for checking this out.